Welcome to Didactic Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a fellow in child and adolescent psychiatry in the National Capital Region. I started this podcast to help me study for my board exams, and I hope it helps you as well for whatever reason you are listening to it. I need to let you know that everything I say here should be considered to be my own opinion, even if I'm referencing other stuff, even if I work for some institution. Everything here is my opinion and my opinion alone. Additionally, I have been experimenting with using AI to assist me with the content creation of this podcast and with my research methods. Specifically for this episode, I used Gemini's deep research tool to produce a detailed overview of pediatric trauma and stressor-related disorders, and then I consolidated that information into a podcast script that includes my own content that's merged with the AI content. I use my own background knowledge as well as I spot check the facts to make sure that the AI isn't just making stuff up. Like humans, AI makes mistakes, but I found more and more it is at least or even more reliable than human-produced content. I want to jump right into this episode with a vignette. A 10-year-old boy, Michael, was a passenger in a car involved in a serious highway collision about 4 months ago. He was uninjured, but his mother sustained significant injuries and was hospitalized for about 2 weeks. At first, Michael seemed to be doing okay, though noticeably more quiet and withdrawn than he had previously been. And that improved, but over the past month, Michael's woken up many nights screaming and often comes to sleep with his parents, something he hasn't done in years. He also has demanded that his parents no longer watch the news because the traffic reports make him nervous. One day, he suddenly refused to travel in the car and insisted that everyone take public transportation. This has improved somewhat, but he still insists that they never take the highway. He has become more argumentative, and there has been an increase in sibling conflict. His teacher reports that he startles easily at loud noises in the classroom, and sometimes because of this, he goes into a kind of rage and it's difficult to calm down. Once he flipped over some chairs, and on another occasion he just obsessively broke an entire box of pencils one at a time, which is something he's never done before. He's no longer completing his schoolwork, and he complains frequently to his parents of difficulty falling asleep most nights, so they've started to give him melatonin, which hasn't been very helpful. What is the most likely diagnosis? Today, I'm going to give you an introduction to diagnosing pediatric trauma and stressor-related disorders, and in a future episode, we'll get into more of the treatment of PTSD in the pediatric population. But today, let's start with diagnosis. And of course, for diagnosis, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and most recently, it's text revision, the DSM-5 TR. For something to be a trauma and stressor-related disorder, there has to be exposure to a traumatic or stressful event. So this is the primary diagnostic criterion for all conditions included within this group. In previous editions, conditions that were like PTSD were often categorized as anxiety disorders. So the creation of this dedicated chapter reflected an understanding that the experience of trauma itself or of severe stress itself is a critical factor that shapes subsequent psychopathology. So it distinguishes it from conditions like anxiety that might arise without explicit or severe precipitating events. This has an implication for how we clinically assess patients because we have to prioritize a trauma history in order to understand that what they are experiencing now is a result of trauma. Exposure to trauma is pretty common in childhood and adolescence, and many children do not develop trauma disorders afterwards. Some of the epidemiological data suggests that about a quarter of children in the United States before age 4 will witness some kind of traumatic event. And by the time they're 16, reports are about 2/3 of children will have experienced some kind of traumatic event. We know these experiences are not benign. Childhood trauma, even things like neglect or just witnessing violence toward other people or experiencing a natural disaster, like losing your home, These things can exert profound and enduring effects on a child's developing brain, their emotional regulation capacities, how they form attachments in the future, and their overall mental and physical health. So the consequences can be far reaching and can cascade into many negative outcomes that extend across an individual's lifespan if it isn't identified and treated. But the first step is identification. The DSM-5 provides the diagnostic criteria for the trauma and stressor related disorders. And the thing people probably think of first when they think of trauma and stressor related disorders is PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder. The PTSD has different standards for an adolescent or an adult and children 6 and under, because the way that symptoms are expressed by these different developmental groups can be very different. So I'm going to focus here on the criteria for children 6 and younger first, because they're tailored to reflect the developmental capacities and the expressions of distress common in people 6 and under. So criterion A, of course, requires an actual exposure to something: threatened death, serious illness, sexual violence through direct experience, or witnessing event, especially something that has occurred to a primary caregiver, or even learning that the traumatic event occurred to a parent or a caregiving figure. Notably, witnessing events only on electronic media, unless it is occurring to your primary caregiver. Things like television, movies, or seeing things in pictures does not qualify. There are extenuating circumstances, such as that picture was used to traumatize the child intentionally, but that gets into very special cases that you're probably not going to see on the boards. Criterion B is that there has to be some kind of intrusive symptoms. So, intrusive symptoms are things like memories of an event or thoughts about the event. They're often involuntary, they come without you wanting them to be there. For very young kids, these memories are often expressed as play reenactment. So, as they're playing, they begin to reenact the scene that they saw. And that's more common in young kids than actually going through and talking about the event from start to finish. Recurrent distressing dreams are very frequent, so the kid might start to have nightmares afterward. They may not be able to tell you about the nightmares, but you can see that they're having them. Now, dissociative reactions like flashbacks that in older adults can be talked about, in younger kids, it's harder to see things like this. So, really, you have to pay attention to things like play reenactment and what it is that they're doing. You might notice that there is intense, prolonged physiological reactions to things that they wouldn't have reacted to so much before. They may become very worked up and hard to calm down. Criterion C combines two criteria from older children and adult criteria. So it combines avoidance with negative alterations in cognitions and mood. And this is one of the big differences between the two, is that for adults, you need at least one avoidance symptom and at least one negative alteration in cognition and mood symptom. But for children, you combine them both together and you only need one symptom from this combined category. Persistent avoidance of something that reminds you of the trauma. So this includes things like activities that you participated in, places you have been, pictures, movies, the news, people, conversations about things. All of those can result in discomfort or trigger the intrusive symptoms, and so they are actively avoided. Negative alterations in cognition and mood refer mainly to like emotional states and how you think about the world because of those states. You may be experiencing fear, guilt, sadness, shame, or even just kind of confusion about what's going on. And this can be associated with depressive symptoms, like a diminished interest in participating in activities that you used to enjoy. For kids, this might look like constricted play, where they don't play as much or they're not as active during play as they were before. Often there's social withdrawal, which looks like avoidance. So they prefer to be by themselves or will decline going and playing where they used to do that more frequently. And then there's often a persistent reduction in the expression of positive emotions. So a kid who used to be very happy all the time might appear either neutral or a little sad or anxious. So for young kids, 6 and under, the criteria do not include symptoms like amnesia for details about the events. So this is not something you would think of to try to evaluate in kids 6 and under because it, they already have difficulty in talking about events and remembering things in order. So it wouldn't be something that would be that useful to try to use as a diagnostic criteria in this group. And you also wouldn't want to use something that you can use for adults, which is the distorted blame of the self or of others who really aren't reasonably responsible for what happened. So for young kids, they very often, because they're so egocentric, will just blame themselves for what's going on around them. So this would not be a very specific thing for post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a more generalized things that young kids do. So it's not included as a criteria. Whereas in adults, it's not a thing that they tend to do because they're less egocentric and they have a greater ability to determine causation in the world. So just to review that real quick. In adult criteria, avoidance and negative alterations in cognition and mood are two separate categories, and you need one of each. In kids 6 and under, they're combined together, and you only need one symptom. The next criterion in kids 6 and under, it's criterion D. In adults, it would be criterion E, is alterations in arousal and reactivity. So at least two symptoms here are required. And in kids, it's not hard to meet the symptom burden. It requires things like irritable behavior, angry outbursts, and this is often with little or no provocation, or there is provocation and the kid used to be able to handle that, but no longer. I think the way that the kids would say it now is they crash out. I'm going to crash out. But in very young kids, this could be manifested as like temper tantrums, where you're not quite sure why they're having the temper tantrum, or they used to have them sometimes, but they become more frequent and more sustained than they used to be. Other symptoms of hypervigilance might be like an exaggerated startle response. It can also be problems concentrating on what's going on in front of you because your mind is wandering off or you are worried about something else. And then sleep disturbances, falling asleep, staying asleep. Sleep doesn't feel as restful anymore. It's important to note that in adults, there is a criterion reckless or self destructive behavior, and that would meet alterations in arousal and reactivity. But in kids 6 and under, a lot of their behaviors, because they're not able to predict the world as well as adults do, appear reckless and self destructive. So it's not a criterion in the age group 6 and under. Of course, after this, the symptom criteria, there's the duration criteria. And for PTSD, the disturbance, the symptoms have to last for more than a month. And you don't have to have all of them for more than a month, but you have to have some sort of significant symptom for more than a month. The symptom has to cause some sort of functional impairment. And then these symptoms can't be due to something like drug use or another medical condition. So that is how you diagnose PTSD in kids. There are two sets. One is the adult set, and one is 6 years and younger. And this is because you have to have a developmentally sensitive diagnostic approach. You have to know how a child would express things depending on their developmental level. Younger children more likely to express traumatic experiences and re-experiencing symptoms through their behavior, things like play or fighting. You could consider this to be like trauma reenactment. But just because a child reenacts violence, that doesn't mean that they have been abused. I mean, they may just have parents that are permissive about the videos that they watch on YouTube. And some kids, without ever having been abused themselves, just go around, push, kick, and bite other children. And it's not because they have been traumatized or ever beaten by their parents. It's just something that they do. So you can't reliably say that because someone is doing this, they must have trauma. So that's PTSD, but there are a lot of other disorders. We can talk about acute stress disorder. So this is very similar to PTSD, and I'm not going to go through the criterion step by step, but I want to point out why you would call something an acute stress disorder instead of PTSD. And this is because the symptoms, the PTSD-like symptoms that we talked about earlier, have been present for at least 3 days and not more than a month. So once it passes the month criteria, then you have post traumatic stress disorder. And acute stress reactions often include a lot of dissociative symptoms, altered feelings of the sense of reality of surrounding oneself, like feeling like you're in a daze, feeling like time has either slowed down or you just lose time, inability to remember what has happened to you. That's something that in trauma reactions is common. So I wanted to mention that. For acute stress disorder, the main difference is the duration. It has to be 3 days to 1 month. After a month, it's PTSD. Now, before I move on, let me tell you about Jamal. Jamal is an 8-year-old boy, and he recently moved to a new city and started a new school 6 weeks ago due to his father's military move. His parents report that since the move, Jamal, who was previously an outgoing and friendly, a good student, has become increasingly withdrawn. He often cries before school, and he expresses a lot of worry about not being able to make friends. His grades have dropped. He's started refusing to participate in a lot of the class activities. Once he even eloped from the school during lunch, and the police had to be called to go find him. He frequently talks about missing his old friends and his old school, and he has threatened to run away. And mom has even found him once, like packing a bag. Now, during the encounter, you determine that Jamal does not meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So, what is the most likely diagnosis for Jamal? Is it acute stress disorder? Is it social anxiety disorder? Is it generalized anxiety disorder? Or is it adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood? Well, the correct answer here is an adjustment disorder, and we're going to talk about exactly why Jamal meets criteria for that. So, adjustment disorders are characterized by emotional and behavioral symptoms that are a response to an identifiable stressor. It doesn't have to be a traumatic stressor, but it's an identifiable stressor. And the response is clinically significant. But the stressor itself is not necessarily so severe that it would be called PTSD or acute stress disorder. So the diagnostic criteria are different than those for the trauma disorders. So criterion A is the development of emotional and behavioral symptoms that were in response to an identifiable stressor, and it had to occur within 3 months of the symptoms coming on. The stressors can be really diverse. It can include things like parents divorcing, moving, school difficulties, some bullying in school, the illness of a family member is often something. Now, criterion B is that the behaviors or the felt symptoms have to be clinically significant. And if they're in your office, that basically means they're clinically significant, right? So the distress has to be out of proportion to the intensity or severity of the stressor. So if it seems to be an appropriate response to what happened, I watched my mom die in the hospital and I'm very, very sad. That is not a adjustment disorder. That's grief. And you also have to take into account things and cultural factors that might influence the severity of the presentation, because in some cultures, expressions of emotions can be expected to be and generally are more dramatic in some ways. So you can't judge based on what you would do or what your culture is if someone's coming from a different space. And then there have to be significant impairments in social or occupational or academic, if you're talking about kids, areas of functioning. So really, really young kids are probably not going to get this diagnosis. This is something that might um, be more school-age children. Also, they can't meet criteria for another mental disorder. And it's not merely an exacerbation of a previous mental disorder. Now, this gets a little sketchy at times because you can have other mental disorders like generalized anxiety disorder, and then you can have a stressor happen, and then you can have adjustment issues. Here, they're basically saying, treat their generalized anxiety disorder and don't call that an adjustment disorder, even though they got substantially worse because of their inability to adjust to that stressor. And of course, as I mentioned before, the symptoms are not normal bereavement. You can't call grief an adjustment disorder. Once the stressor or its consequences have terminated, the symptoms do not persist for more than an additional 6 months. So, in order to be an adjustment disorder, the symptoms have to go away after the stressor is taken away. This means that the symptoms were a response to the stressor. Once the stressor is gone, the symptoms will be gone. It may take some time. It could take up to 6 months, but they're going to go away. Now, there are a lot of subtypes you can specify for adjustment disorders. You can say it has an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or with anxiety, or with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, or with disturbance of conduct. So, this is where kids might violate social norms or the rights of others. They might do vandalism, steal things, break things. Now, truancy also is listed here as disturbance of conduct, but I don't really consider truancy to be a huge violation of societal norms for a kid who's experiencing a lot of distress. So you could put that on there, but it's for me, truancy is it's more normalized in my mind that a kid is not going to want to go to school if they're experiencing a lot of distress. So I don't think of that as a disturbance of conduct, but that's just my opinion. There's also a specifier with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct. So that's if you have anxiety and depressed mood and you do things that are conduct disturbances. Now let's discuss two very different kinds of trauma diagnoses. These are very different from the other trauma diagnoses, particularly in that they tend to affect very young children because the trauma happens at early developmental stages. So let me start with Anna. Anna's a 3-year-old. She was adopted a year ago from an Eastern European orphanage where she spent the first 2 years of her life with a really high child to caregiver ratio. And so she got minimal attention from her caregivers, was mostly left alone. Her adoptive parents report that Anna doesn't really seek much comfort when she's hurt. Doesn't appear to come to them when she's scared. She just kind of walks over to the corner and sits there. And when she gets upset, she doesn't come to mom for any sort of comfort. When they attempt to comfort her, she often stiffens up and just doesn't really show much response to them or even has walked away from them. They also noted that she rarely smiles or laughs at all. Often does appear to be sad or irritable, even when she's safe at home with her parents and there's nothing really wrong, at least identifiably wrong. So, assuming with Anna that we've already ruled out autism spectrum disorder, what is the most likely diagnosis? Now, before I tell you that, let me tell you about Tom. Tom's a 4-year-old boy. He's been in the foster care system since infancy and has experienced 5 different placements. His current foster parents report Tom's really overly friendly with strangers. At the park, he'll just approach unfamiliar adults, sit down on the bench with them, start conversations. He's even tries to sit in their lap. He asks strangers for hugs. He often wanders away from his foster mother in public places, and she has to go look for him. And on one occasion, he even attempted to get into a car with an unfamiliar woman who he had just met, and she had said something nice to him. So, assuming now that we have ruled out ADHD, what is Tom's most likely diagnosis? Here I'm going to talk about 2 different diagnoses. One is reactive attachment disorder, and one is disinhibited social engagement disorder. Let's start with reactive attachment disorder. So it's a condition of early childhood, and it's characterized by disturbed and developmentally inappropriate attachment behaviors. And this is a result of grossly inadequate or pathogenic care when they were younger. So, criterion A is a consistent pattern of inhibited, emotionally withdrawn behavior toward adult caregivers, and it has to be manifest by both. The child rarely or minimally seeks comfort when distressed. The child rarely or minimally responds to comfort when distressed. Criterion B is that there have to be persistent social and emotional disturbances. So, they have to have at least 2 of the following 3: minimal social and emotional responses to other people, a limited positive affect, or episodes of unexplained irritability, sadness, or fearfulness that are evident even during non threatening interactions with adult caregivers. Now we get to criterion C, which is the etiology criterion. And the exposure is an experience of a pattern of extremes of insufficient care as evidenced by at least one of the following: social neglect or deprivation in the form of persistent lack of having basic emotional needs for comfort, stimulation, and affection met by caring adults. 2. Repeated changes of primary caregivers that limit opportunities to form stable attachments over time. So frequent changes in foster care meet that criteria. 3. Rearing in unusual settings that severely limit opportunities to form selective attachments. So this could be in like things like in institutions where there's that high child to caregiver ratio. Now, criterion D states that you have to draw some sort of causal link between what happened to them when they were young and their behaviors. So the care in criteria C is presumed to be responsible for the behavior in criteria A. You can't explain the criteria A behavior better than by criterion C. And of course, it can't be in the presence of autism spectrum disorder, which itself could explain a lot of these things. And the disturbance has to be evident before the age of 5, because this is a developmental disturbance. And you can't diagnose it before developmental age of at least 9 months. Now, the sister diagnosis, kind of an opposite diagnosis to reactive attachment disorder, is disinhibited social engagement disorder. This disorder also stems from early childhood experience of neglect frequently, but it's characterized by a pattern of overly familiar and culturally inappropriate behaviors with unfamiliar adults. So instead of them like not seeking out adults, they seek out any adult. Any old adult will do. So criterion A is a pattern of behavior in which a child actively approaches and interacts with unfamiliar adults and exhibits at least two of the following: reduced or absent reticence in approaching and interacting with unfamiliar adults, overly familiar verbal or physical behaviors. This is things like, going up and hugging strangers, unless that's culturally appropriate. But in most cultures, it's not. There can be also a diminished or absent checking back with their adult caregiver after they venture away. So they just seem to not care. They seem to feel safe around anyone and they don't care to check back with mom. And they'll often just be willing to go off with any adult with minimal or no hesitation. So those are the 4 things in criterion A. They only need 2 of those. Criterion B is that the behaviors in criterion A are not limited only to impulsivity, like in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is very important because a lot of kids with ADHD, when they're very young, especially if the ADHD is severe, they don't develop stranger danger. They just go off away from mom without thinking. And it's not due to a trauma in their past or neglect in their past. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. And then once they start getting treatment, a lot of times they will develop this kind of awareness that they didn't have before. And they will start to check back with mom. And they will start to be more shy around strangers. So it can't be ADHD or something like it. The etiology has to be the pathogenic care. The child has experienced a pattern of extreme or insufficient care as evidenced by at least one of the following: social neglect or deprivation in the form of persistent lack of having basic emotional needs for comfort, stimulation, and affection met by caring adults, repeated changes of primary caregivers that limit opportunities to form stable attachments, and rearing in unusual settings that severely limit opportunities to form selective attachments. And similarly to reactive attachment disorder, the child's developmental age has to be at least 9 months. And it can be also persistent and severe if you want to use those specifications. So the distinction between this reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, despite both originating from very similar conditions of severe early neglect, really highlights a different ways that we can maladaptively respond to situations. So reactive attachment disorder manifests as inhibited withdrawn patterns, failure to seek comfort, and it suggests a profound disruption in the formation of the attachment. But in disinhibited social engagement disorder, they have indiscriminate, overly familiar approaches to strangers. One way to think about this is using an attractor landscape metaphor. So during development, there's sort of a balance between engagement and avoidance or disengagement. But both are really necessary at different points in time. So if you think of a set of space where there's an x-axis, and that x-axis is either engagement on the positive side, a lack of engagement near the origin, and then avoidance on the negative side. And the y-axis is the strength of the effect of avoidance or engagement. And negative effect numbers are stronger attractors because they create like a deep well in which you could put a ball into it. Like you roll a ball down a well, the deeper the well, the more likely it's going to stay there. But the strength of these attractors should change over time. There could even be repellers where a ball would have a hard time going up a hill. So if you think about this sort of landscape, you could have attractors on both sides, and the strength of these is really dependent upon circumstances. So imagine that someone sees a familiar face that they haven't seen in a long time. The attractor space should shift from being relatively neutral near the origin to having a deep well on the engagement side. So the ball would roll downhill toward the deep engagement attractor. But the opposite could be said when a stranger approaches, where a deep well would form either in the avoidant side or near the neutral side. The typically developing kid's attractor landscape should shift either to neutral or avoidant when strangers are around, or to engagement when there are familiar people around. So reactive attachment disorder can be characterized by as an overly stable attractor state either near the origin with no interaction or toward the negative end where there is avoidance. But in disinhibited social engagement disorder, there is an overly stable attractor on the positive side of the graph. Now, these diagnoses suggest that there can be only one overly stable attractor, either overly engaged or underly engaged. But kids who have experienced trauma may actually have two stable attractor states, one on each side of the landscape, and some kind of reminder or trigger could provide enough energy needed to kind of bump that ball out of one attractor into the other. So instead of them just being avoidant or unengaged, they might shift between the two different states. So trauma can reduce the variability or the malleability of attractor states toward being just more rigid in general and less flexible, at least on the time scales in which they are supposed to be flexing. So that would result in things that look like borderline personality disorder, or in the extreme, might even fracture someone's identity into distinct parts that are really dissociated from each other. So we call this dissociative identity disorder, and the vast majority of cases are associated with significant sustained trauma or neglect, especially in early childhood. But that's a topic for a future podcast, because even though dissociative identity disorder could easily be put into the trauma disorders chapter, it is not. So I want to start to wrap this episode up by talking about how you can diagnose other specified trauma and stress-related disorders or unspecified trauma-related disorders. So you might use these categories where someone doesn't quite meet the criteria of something else. Maybe they have some but not all of it, but they do have functional impairments. So you can just specify this. And then there's cultural phenomenon. The DSM likes to talk about ataque de nervios, which is in those of Hispanic descent, and it's often triggered by stressful family events, like the death of a family member, really intense family conflict, and there can be this intense emotional upset, screaming, crying, trembling, um, and even dissociative experiences. I once watched a woman whose daughter just had bonked her nose, and as soon as she saw the blood, she acted exactly like this. She got super upset. Mom started screaming, crying, trembling. I was like, wow, this is ataque de nervios right in front of me. But there are other cultural syndromes like, and please forgive me for messing this up, the kufungisisa, and this roughly translates to just thinking too much. And it's characterized by excessive worry and rumination. It's recognized in several African, Caribbean, Latin American, East Asian, and Native American cultures. And there's also something called susto, and it's a Latin American cultural syndrome where frightening events are thought to cause the soul to basically leave the body. So this is very much a dissociative type reaction to trauma. Another reason to give something like unspecified trauma and stressor related disorder is in a situation in which you just don't have the time to do a full diagnostic workup. And this is often the case for like consult liaison services going down into the emergency department in order to get a history. You don't have the time to kind of confirm everything, get all of the collateral that you need, and really do a good assessment, so you can just write down unspecified trauma and stress related disorder, and clinicians can see that and look at that as a clue to try to get more specific information. I'm going to wrap this episode up. And in a future episode, we're going to go deeper into these trauma and stressor related disorders. And then after that, I want to go into dissociative experiences and dissociative disorders in particular. So stick around for those future episodes. Until then, I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.